Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Somewhere in the dark, between the stars, something is moving. It has no name for itself. It does not dream. It does not plan in any way you or I would recognize as planning. It simply hungers. And it is very, very old. Out beyond the rim of the galaxy, past the last blazing stars, past the furthest colony worlds, past every map the Imperium of man has ever drawn, there is a void so complete that not even light dares linger there. And from that void, something enormous has come calling. Not a ship, not an army, a hunger with the mass of a solar system, wrapped in living chitin and driven by a mind so alien that even the gods of the warp are said to flinch from its shadow. Hive fleet, Leviathan. The third and largest Tyranid hive fleet ever to descend upon our galaxy. When it arrived in 997 of the 41st Millennium, yes, it didn't fall upon the galaxy the way the other fleets had. It didn't come from the eastern fringe, the direction the Imperium had been nervously watching for decades. It came from beneath. It rose up through the galactic plane like something enormous, surfacing from unfathomably deep water, spreading its tendrils in two vast arms spaced hundreds of light years apart. A pair of closing jaws designed to cut entire sectors off from communication, from reinforcement, from hope. Close your eyes for a moment and try to picture the actual scale of this. The galaxy is roughly 100,000 light years across. A single light year is the distance light travels in a year, moving at roughly 300,000 kilometers per second, without pause or rest. The distance between Earth and the Moon, to use the only celestial body most people have an intuitive sense of, is about 1¼ light seconds. The nearest star to Earth is over 4 light years away, and Hive Fleet Leviathan's approach vector spanned hundreds of light years across its two main tendrils, a gap so enormous that the worlds trapped between them lost contact with the wider Imperium and simply went silent. One by one, system by system, the silence spreading like a shadow cast by something too large to see directly. That is what the Imperium was dealing with in the dying years of the 41st Millennium. Not a fleet in any conventional sense, not an army, a phenomenon. A biological force of nature as indifferent to the scale of human civilization as a tide is indifferent to a sandcastle. And standing in its path was the galaxy at perhaps its most fractured. The 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon, the despoiler, was already tearing at the Imperium's heart. The fortress world of Cadia, the guardian of the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, was under siege. The worlds of men were stretched thin. Their fleets were committed to a dozen other desperate wars. Their finest warriors were dying for every inch of a crumbling frontier, and there was no sense anywhere in the imperial hierarchy that things were about to get better. Into this moment of maximum crisis came Leviathan, and nobody knew what to do. Nobody, that is, except one man, a former inquisitor named Fidus Cryptman, who had spent 2.5 centuries studying the Great Devourer, and who, by this point in his long and increasingly controversial career, had developed the kind of mind that looks at an extinction-level threat and immediately starts thinking about how to redirect it. The plan he came up with saved billions of lives. It may also, in the long run, have doomed billions more, possibly trillions. This is the story of the Octarius War, a conflict so large, so sustained, and so catastrophically effective at producing more powerful versions of both combatants that it has been called the greatest arms race in the history of the galaxy. Two apex predators, each incapable of mercy, each biologically designed for endless escalation, locked in an embrace so violent and so prolonged that everything within 1,000 light years of it either chose a side or got consumed in the crossfire. Orks versus Tyranids. Brute joy against cold hunger, as the unstoppable force of the greenskin tide against the immovable appetite of the great devourer. but to understand why this war matters, why it echoes through the lore of Warhammer 40,000 in ways that still haven't fully played out. You need to understand something about what both of these species actually are. Not just what they look like, not just what they do in a fight, but what they fundamentally represent in the ecology of the galaxy. Because the Octarius War is not just a big battle. It is the story of what happens when the galaxy's two most biologically perfect killing machines are forced to spend years teaching each other how to be better at killing. It is the story of a man who thought he could use monsters as weapons and discovered that the problem with that plan is that monsters always outgrow the hand that throws them. And it is, perhaps most quietly and most disturbingly, the story of a question that has no good answer. In a universe where every option is terrible, what does responsible action even look like? Pull the blanket a little tighter. Find somewhere comfortable. We're going to take our time with this one. Part 1. A green stain on the stars. The Ork Empire of Octarius. Before we can understand the Octarius War, we need to understand the world it was fought in. And before we can understand that, we need to understand the Orks. Really understand them. Not as the comic villains they sometimes appear. Yet not as the generic fantasy monster stand-in they might look like on the surface, but as what they actually are in the ecology of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. There's a tendency, when people first encounter the greenskins, to dismiss them as comic relief. And honestly, from a certain angle, it's hard not to see why. They're loud, they're chaotic. They paint things red to make them go faster, and somehow, through the collective belief of millions of orcs, this actually works. Because the greenskins have a latent psychic field that does genuinely make things work better if enough of them believe strongly enough that those things work. Their technology is cobbled together from whatever they could find. Their ships are barely held together by rust and stubborn optimism. And their entire culture could charitably be described as enthusiastic violence pursued with religious conviction. But here's the thing. The Orks are the single most successful species in the galaxy, bar none. They occupy more space than any other race. Their numbers are beyond calculation. They have no homeworld in any meaningful sense, because everywhere they go, they become the homeworld. Every orc that dies releases spores into the soil, and from those spores grow fungi, and from those fungi, given enough time, come more orcs. The fungi don't just produce orcs either. They produce the full ecosystem of greenskin civilization, including smaller subspecies like Gretchen and Snotlings. And the particular biology of the orc race is such that these spores can survive in almost any environment. Or you cannot fully eradicate them from a planet without burning every molecule of organic matter off its surface. And even then, you're probably too late. The orcs have been fighting since before humanity learned to farm. They were old when the Elder Empire was young. They exist, as the ancient stories tell it, to fight. It's written into their very genetics, encoded into them by the Old Ones as weapons of war so long ago that the civilization that made them has been gone for 60 million years. The Old Ones, for those unfamiliar, were one of the oldest and most advanced civilizations the galaxy had ever produced, and their great enemies were the Necrontyr, the beings who would eventually become the undying metal warriors known as the Necrons. In the conflict between these ancient powers, the Old Ones needed soldiers. Yet they engineered them. The Orks are the result of that engineering, a species purpose-built for war, given instincts and biology, and even reproductive systems oriented entirely around combat. The problem was that the Old Ones were destroyed before they could turn off what they had created, and the Orks have been fighting ever since. Not because they were told to, not because they have goals in any conventional sense, but because fighting is what they are, in the same way that breathing is what a human is. When orcs fight, they grow. Not metaphorically, literally. The more intense the conflict, the more their biology responds. Growth hormones flood their systems. Their already formidable muscle density increases. The thick, armored skin of an experienced orc becomes tougher and more resistant to damage. A war boss who has survived 1,000 battles is physically larger, physically stronger, and physically more resilient than one who has only seen 100. Significantly so, in ways that are visible to the naked eye. Their biology rewards violence with size, in a feedback loop that means the most dangerous orcs are not just dangerous because they've had practice, but because the practice has physically remade them. Their culture reinforces this. Leadership among orcs is determined entirely by who can make the most orcs afraid to challenge them. There is no hereditary title, no democratic process, no wisdom of elders. There is only the simple, brutal arithmetic of who is the biggest and who is the meanest. And the orc, who can satisfactorily answer both questions, keeps his position until someone bigger and meaner comes along. This creates an interesting evolutionary pressure within orc society. The leaders are always the survivors of the most intense conflicts, because surviving intense conflicts is what makes you big enough to lead. In the ecology of war, they are perfectly adapted predators. And in the Ultima Segmentum, in a cluster of star systems sitting just southwest of the great warp anomaly called the Maelstrom, the Orks had built something remarkable, even by their standards. The Orc Empire of Octarius. Centered on the mountain world of Octarius, called Octaria in some imperial records, this empire sprawled across a region of space comparable in size to the realm of Ultramar. Think about that for a moment. Ultramar, the domain of the Ultramarines, is one of the most well-organized and well-defended swaths of the Imperium's territory, spanning multiple star systems and maintained by the finest administrative minds the Emperor ever produced. It is, by any measure, a significant achievement of human civilization. And the Orks had built an empire to match it through nothing but conquest, violence, and the psychic gravitational pull that a sufficiently powerful greenskin warlord exerts on lesser members of his species. No planning, no administration, no infrastructure investment, just force and the willingness to apply it until everything else got in line. The mechanism by which orc empires form is one of the more interesting aspects of greenskin biology. All orcs participate in a shared psychic field, a kind of species-wide gestalt that doesn't allow individual telepathy, but does create a collective emotional weather. When a particularly powerful orc achieves something impressive, other orcs feel it as a resonance in this shared field, a kind of psychic advertisement for this individual's power. This draws them in. The more orcs gather around a successful warlord, the stronger the resonance becomes, which draws more orcs, which strengthens the resonance further, a feedback loop that, when conditions are right, can snowball a local gang of greenskins into a planet-spanning empire within a single generation. At the heart of the Octarian Empire sat the Overfiend of Octarius. The title tells you everything you need to know about the kind of orc required to hold it. The Overfiend wasn't just powerful. Any war boss worth his scrap metal was powerful. The Overfiend had to be the kind of entity that could stare down every challenger in a sector-wide empire, and maintain order through sheer intimidation, and still command the loyalty of millions of orcs who individually wanted nothing more than to fight him for his spot. This was a warlord who had survived every assassination attempt, won every challenge, and ground every rival into the dust beneath his boots, and had done it so thoroughly and so repeatedly that even the most ambitious underlings had quietly decided that maybe today wasn't the day. The Overfiend's authority extended across dozens of worlds, coordinated not through any formal bureaucracy, but through the simple principle that anyone who didn't follow his lead would be visited by the Overfiend personally, and those visits tended to be very short and very violent. Beneath him, a structure of war bosses managed individual worlds and star systems, and each one powerful enough to command thousands of orcs, each one knowing that his position depended on demonstrating results, meaning successful raids, meaningful fights, and the steady expansion of orc influence in his sector. Octaria itself was a world of snow-capped mountain ranges and vast mega-continents, its surface buried under the accumulated sprawl of orc civilization. And if you're picturing something like a human city, stop. Orc civilization is something else entirely. It's a sprawl of scrap metal towers and fortified bunkers, of crude forges hammering out weapons at all hours, of mechs, the Ork engineers and mechanics, tinkering with machines that by any right should not work at all, and yet somehow do, through that same psychic belief mechanism that makes red paint genuinely speed things up. And it smells of oil and grease, and the specific kind of aggression that hangs in the air when a million beings who live for fighting are all in the same place at the same time. Ork mechs occupy a special position in greenskin society. They are the closest thing to scientists and engineers that greenskin culture produces, with an intuitive and psychically assisted relationship to technology that allows them to build working devices from whatever materials are available. A mech can take a pile of scrap metal, some wiring, a few explosive charges of uncertain provenance, and build something that shoots reliably. This is not because Orks are secretly skilled engineers. It is because enough Orks believe that the mech's device will shoot, that the shared psychic field reinforces the device's function, filling in the gaps that normal physics would leave in its engineering. The result is technology that, assessed by any rational standard, should not work at all, but does. And does so with a reliability that has alarmed Imperial tech priests for as long as the two species have been in contact. On Octaria, the mechs were some of the most prolific the Empire had ever produced, working in deep forges beneath the mountain ranges to build the weapons and vehicles and fortifications that made the capital world formidable. The planet's shantytown capital, known as Gargates, was the seat of the Overfiend's power. Great walls of scavenged metal and reinforced concrete guarded its approaches. Mega weapons and heavy gun emplacements dotted its heights. In its deepest forges, Master mechs built devices of questionable sanity and unquestionable destructive potential. It was, in its own way, magnificent, a monument to what violence can build when it's pointed consistently enough in one direction. Beyond Octaria, the worlds of the Empire were equally alive with the endless churn of greenskin activity. World after world of Orks, some gathering into vast war bands, some building fleets of ramshackle but terrifying spacecraft, some simply existing in the particular brand of productive chaos that Orks generate wherever they go. They raided neighboring systems. They fought each other when there was nobody else available. They maintained a kind of enforced stability through the sheer weight of the Overfiend's reputation, and through the understanding that the best alternative to fighting the Tyranids, which was what the Overfiend wanted from his Orks, was getting beaten up by the Overfiend himself, which nobody particularly wanted. And the Ork Empire wasn't merely powerful in political terms. As a source of biomass, as a concentration of living, fighting organisms, it was staggering. Billions upon billions of greenskins across dozens of worlds. Every one of them, tough, belligerent, and packed with the kind of dense, protein-rich musculature that sustained a species designed for war. They ate voraciously. They grew through fighting. They bred through spores and fungi, in numbers that made precise population estimates impossible. And all of it, all that teeming vitality, all those billions of fighting organisms packed into a cluster of star systems, not much more than a sector wide, sat right in the path of the greatest hunger the galaxy had ever produced. It is worth noting here that the Ork Empire of Octarius was not alone in its class. Across the Ultima Segmentum, a rival empire centered on the world of Sharadon matched it in scale and influence, controlled by the terrifying Ork warlord known as the Arch-Arsonist, who measured his victories not in worlds conquered, but in worlds left burning. The two empires were, in the grand map of greenskin politics, something like equals, both vast, both dangerous, both representing the kind of concentrated greenskin power that made imperial strategists nervous even in the best of times. In the worst of times, as an Ork empire of that size was effectively a civilization-level threat, but before the hammer fell on Octarius, someone had to pick it up and aim it, and the person who did that had been preparing to do something exactly like it for most of his very long life. Part 2. The Great Devourer. Hive fleet, Leviathan arrives. Picture a tide, not a wave, a tide. The slow, inevitable, geologic movement of water that doesn't crash so much as it rises, and keeps rising, until everything that once stood above it is swallowed. That's the closest human metaphor for what a Tyranid hive fleet looks like from space. Not a rush, but a swell. A darkening of the void that resolves, on closer inspection, into the shapes of living ships the size of continents. The Tyranids are unlike anything else the galaxy has produced. While they are not conquerors in any sense humanity would recognize, they don't want land. They don't want resources in the conventional sense, the minerals, the fuel, the territory that most species fight over. They want matter, organic matter specifically, proteins and carbon chains and water and the chemical building blocks of life, all of it rendered down into the undifferentiated biological soup called biomass, packed into biological containers the size of asteroids and carried away to feed the endless growth of the fleet. Everything the Tyranids do serves this purpose. Their bioforms, the creatures they deploy in battle, are not soldiers in any conventional sense. They are tools, highly specialized, purpose-built biological weapons whose only function is to facilitate the consumption of a world. Some are designed to kill defenders. And some are designed to harvest the fallen. Some are designed to break down organic matter into its component parts for easy absorption. Some are designed to terraform the atmosphere, to begin the process of rendering a world's air breathable for digestion organisms before the final phase of consumption. There are bioforms designed for nearly every conceivable ecological niche, and the hive mind produces new ones as needs arise. A Tyranid invasion unfolds in stages, each one more horrible than the last. First come the vanguard organisms, lictors and rippers, moving in the deep shadow ahead of the fleet, slipping past defenses, establishing themselves in the dark places of a world before anyone knows they're there. They eat, they observe. They send chemical and psychic signals back to the fleet that add to the hive mind's growing model of the target world. Then come the genestealer cults, if the fleet has time to plant them, infiltrating communities, spreading their genetic modification through generations of hybrid offspring who eventually form the fifth column that will rise up at exactly the wrong moment for whoever is defending. When the fleet itself arrives and the bioships release their cargo into the atmosphere, the vast biological drop pods called mycetic spores, each one carrying thousands of dormant organisms, the world is already half defeated before a shot is fired. The shadow in the warp has blanketed all communication. The genestealer cult is creating chaos in the rear. The lictors have mapped every defensive position. And now the sky is full of falling death, and it just keeps falling, and falling, and falling. The consumption of a world takes time. The actual fighting, depending on the world's defenses, can last anywhere from days to months. But the end result is always the same. The Tyranids strip the world to bedrock. Not just the population, everything. The animals, the plants, the bacteria, the fungi, the very organic material of the soil. Vast biological structures called capillary towers grow from the consumed material, pumping biomass up to the waiting bioships in orbit. When it's over, the world is a bare rock. Not dead in the way a burned world is dead. More completely dead than that. Chemically stripped. Even the water is often gone. And then the fleet moves on, and it is larger now, and the next world is marginally easier than the last. Our hive fleet Leviathan was the third and largest such fleet to enter the galaxy. The first, hive fleet behemoth, had fallen on Ultramar and been broken at the Battle of Macragge. Broken at terrible cost, with the Ultramarines' entire first company dying to the last man holding the polar fortress, but broken nonetheless. The second, hive fleet Kraken, had spread across the eastern fringe in hundreds of splinter tendrils, devouring dozens of worlds before being contained through a combination of military action and the efforts of the Aeldari. Neither of those defeats had slowed the broader Tyranid advance from outside the galaxy. Leviathan was different in character from its predecessors. Behemoth had been a single massive thrust, powerful but linear. Kraken had been adaptive and difficult to pin down, but ultimately fragmented under sustained pressure. Leviathan combined the raw mass of Behemoth with a strategic sophistication that suggested the hive mind had learned from the failures of both. It attacked from a direction the Imperium wasn't watching. It spread its forces across a front so wide that containing it at any single point was meaningless. You couldn't guard everything, and every world that fell fed the fleet and made the next assault marginally stronger. To understand what made Leviathan so specifically threatening, you need to understand the shadow in the warp properly. This is not just an inconvenience. This is not merely jamming enemy communications. The shadow in the warp is the natural psychic emanation of a billion minds unified in a single consciousness. And it is so powerful that it doesn't just block signals, it actively damages the minds of anyone sensitive to the warp. Astropaths, the psychic communicators that connect worlds across the Imperium, don't just lose their signals when a hive fleet approaches. They experience the shadow as a physical thing, a pressure, a cold, an alien wrongness that can incapacitate or kill them. Their ability to send and receive messages degrades and then fails entirely. The worlds in a hive fleet's path go dark before the fleet even arrives, unable to call for help, unable to warn their neighbors. Leviathan's two tendrils, spread hundreds of light years apart, projected a shadow that covered an area of space so vast that entire sectors were effectively cut off from Imperial communication simultaneously. The worlds between the jaws of those tendrils stopped transmitting. Ships trying to navigate through the affected region found the warp unnaturally turbulent, their navigators struggling to maintain course against psychic interference. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided Imperial navigators across the galaxy, became unreliable in the affected zones. It was this characteristic pattern, the silencing of worlds, the turbulence in the warp, that Kryptman recognized first. He had seen it before with Behemoth. He had seen it again with Kraken. He knew what the silence meant, the way a doctor knows what certain vital signs mean, not because it's pleasant knowledge, but because knowing it gives you options that ignorance doesn't. He began the Kryptman census immediately, burning out astropaths one after another, pushing the psychic communication network to its absolute limits, mapping the spread of silence across the southern galaxy to determine Leviathan's approach vector, speed, and scale. It was an act of pragmatic brutality that cost dozens of lives. Astropaths who were essentially burned out trying to reach through the shadow, but it gave Kryptman the information he needed. What he found was worse than anything Behemoth or Kraken had represented. Leviathan was larger, it was faster. It was already deeper into the Imperium's territory than it should have been given when the first signs appeared. And it was adapting. The bioforms being reported from the leading edge of the invasion were unlike the Tyranids Imperial forces had faced in previous engagements, and optimized in ways that suggested the hive mind had studied what killed its organisms in the first two Tyrannic wars, and had spent the intervening decades solving those problems. The war for Tarsis Ultra, which Kryptman would attend, and where a tendril of Leviathan would be stopped through the combined efforts of the Ultramarines, the Mortifactors, 2 regiments of the Astra Militarum, and a Deathwatch kill team, was a victory. It was also a preview of what fighting Leviathan at full strength would look like, and what it showed was not encouraging. Kryptman had already been thinking about the bigger picture. He had already been running the numbers. How many worlds were in Leviathan's path? How long it would take for the fleet to consume enough biomass to become unstoppable? How much time the Imperium had before the situation passed, the point where any response was meaningful. And in parallel with those calculations, he had been thinking about the same thing he always thought about when he considered impossible problems: alternatives. What alternatives existed that didn't involve fighting Leviathan directly? What could he do with the tools he had, his Deathwatch allies, his decades of Tyranid expertise, his willingness to make decisions that nobody else would make, that could change the fundamental equation? The answer, when it came to him, was elegant in the way that terrible ideas sometimes are. Not elegant because it was kind or safe or morally defensible. Elegant because it was efficient, because it used the enemy's own nature against it, because it would cost him relatively little. As in terms of the resources he had available to execute, he would feed Leviathan something that would fight back harder than any human army could, something that would hold the fleet's attention for years, something that would engage the hive mind's evolutionary arms race in a direction that was, from the Imperium's immediate perspective, pointed somewhere other than terror. He knew the place. He knew the Orks of Octarius were there, in their millions. He knew that the Tyranids had fought Orks before, in the early stages of previous invasions, and that those engagements had been notably costly to both sides compared to engagements against most other species. He knew that the Orks wouldn't stop when casualties mounted. They'd grow from the fighting, they'd recruit from across the galaxy. But they'd meet every escalation with escalation of their own. He knew, in other words, exactly how bad this was going to get. He just didn't know how it would end. That was the part nobody could know, not even him. Part 3. The Inquisitor Who Played Gods. Cryptman's long war Inquisitor, Lord Fidus Cryptman of the Ordo Xenos, had been fighting the Tyranids for over 250 standard years by the time Leviathan arrived. That number alone should give you some sense of the kind of man he was. Not just old, but old the way only someone with a singular driving purpose becomes old, where every year is fuel for a deeper obsession, and every encounter with the enemy clarifies something that all those years of study have been building toward. The Inquisition's Ordo Xenos exists to study and counter alien threats to the Imperium, as its members are, by definition, people who have dedicated their lives to understanding things that are deeply hostile to humanity's continued existence. Within that organization, the study of the Tyranids was a specialized and not entirely popular field, because the Tyranids did not cooperate with the standard inquisitorial toolkit. You could not interrogate them. You could not negotiate with them. You could not manipulate their political structures or exploit rivalries between factions. They were not political. They were not social. They were a process, like erosion or gravity, and dealing with them required thinking about them as a natural phenomenon, rather than an enemy in the conventional sense. Cryptman was one of the very few Inquisitors who had truly made this mental shift. Yet he had spent decades studying the Tyranids, not as warriors to be defeated, but as a biological system to be understood. He had documented their bioforms in meticulous detail. He had catalogued the behavior of every kind of organism they produced, from the smallest ripper to the largest bio-titan. He had tracked the progression of invasions across multiple worlds and extracted from that data the underlying logic of how the hive mind made its decisions. And the insight that had come to dominate his thinking, the insight that would eventually drive everything he did in the closing years of the 41st millennium, was this: the Tyranids were learning. Every invasion made the next one marginally harder to stop. The bioforms they deployed were not static. The hive mind was analyzing every encounter, and identifying which of its organisms succeeded and which failed, and incorporating those lessons into the genetic template of the next generation. Fighting the Tyranids was fighting a system that was specifically optimizing itself to defeat you. And the more data you gave it, the more battles you fought, the more tactics you deployed, the more of yourself you revealed in the act of fighting back, the better it would be at defeating you next time. This is why Cryptman's cordon plan, as brutally murderous as it was, had a horrible internal logic to it. If the Tyranids couldn't consume the worlds in their path, they couldn't get the data those worlds' defenders would generate. They couldn't analyze the genetic material of the species they hadn't devoured. They would arrive at the next engagement starved, biologically impoverished, and with less material to build new organisms and less information to build them better. You were destroying your own cities to deny the enemy the chance to learn from fighting for them. He was there when Hive Fleet Behemoth fell on Ultramar. It was Cryptman who recognized the earliest signs of that invasion, who burned out dozens of astropaths in the Cryptman census to map Behemoth's approach. He delivered his warning to Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines in time for them to prepare. Macragge survived. The Ultramarines' entire first company died doing it. Veterans in Terminator armor, each one worth 100 lesser warriors, found lying where they had fallen, defending the polar fortress to the absolute last man. The chapter lost irreplaceable warriors in numbers that would take a century to begin filling. But Macragge survived. And the Imperium learned the first and most important lesson about fighting Tyranids. The cost of survival was always higher than you thought it would be. Cryptman was there for Kraken too, and the lesson of that conflict was different, and in some ways worse. Kraken had shattered when threatened, spreading into hundreds of splinter tendrils that dispersed across the eastern fringe and consumed worlds piecemeal rather than in the mass assault of Behemoth. You couldn't destroy Kraken because it didn't have a single location to be destroyed. Every time you defeated a tendril, the remaining ones scattered further. The fleet survived by becoming diffuse, uncontainable, impossible to fully eliminate. And in that diffusion, it consumed dozens of worlds that a more concentrated fleet might never have reached. But 250 years of this had made Cryptman into something that the Inquisition respected and feared in equal measure. He was brilliant. He was utterly without illusions about the nature of the threat. And he was developing an increasingly extreme calculus of acceptable sacrifice that was beginning to worry his colleagues, even before the events of the Third Tyrannic War. The decision to implement the cordon, to exterminate us every world in Leviathan's projected path before the fleet could reach them, was not made lightly. Cryptman knew what he was condemning. He knew the billions of people on those worlds had names, had families, had spent their entire lives in service to the Emperor who was now, through his decision, destroying them. He made the decision anyway. Not with joy, not with indifference, but with the specific and horrible clarity of someone who has calculated that the lives he was spending were the price of saving a larger number of other lives. The Inquisition's response was, in retrospect, inevitable. A Carta Extremis was issued. Cryptman was stripped of his title, condemned as a radical and a traitor, made a wanted man within his own organization. The single largest act of genocide against the Imperium since the Horus Heresy, they called it. And they weren't wrong. Billions had died. The worlds he had burned had been imperial worlds, with populations that had done nothing to deserve their fate, except be in the wrong location, at the wrong moment in history. But the cordon was slowing Leviathan. The numbers were measurably improving. The fleet's pace of advance had slowed. Its biomass accumulation was below projections, as its forces were being spent on worlds that yielded nothing. The strategy was working. It just wasn't enough. It was buying time, not solving the problem. And Cryptman, declared outlaw, still possessing the loyalty of some Deathwatch allies, who believed in his judgment even if they couldn't follow his orders openly, still obsessing over the same calculations he had spent 2 centuries refining, had not stopped looking for the next piece of the plan. The observation that would change everything came from the records of a small and insignificant engagement on a world that nobody in the wider Imperium had thought much about. A world where Orks and a Tyranid advance force had clashed. A battle that, by the standards of the 41st Millennium, had been not much more than a skirmish. But what the records showed was that both sides had been badly hurt. More importantly, what they showed was that the Orks had refused to stop fighting even when it was clear they were losing ground. And the Tyranids, unable to achieve the quick consumption they needed to sustain their advance, had been forced to commit resources to a battle that cost them more than it yielded. Cryptman thought about that for a long time. He thought about what it would look like on a much larger scale. He thought about what the Orks of Octarius would do if a hive fleet arrived on their doorstep. Not just the Orks on one world, but the entire empire. As billions of greenskins, who had spent their lives getting bigger through fighting, and who would view a Tyranid invasion not as a catastrophe, but as the greatest opportunity for violence they had ever been offered. He thought about the fact that the Orks' biology would make them grow stronger through the fighting, while the Tyranids would find themselves in an arms race against an opponent whose arms race moved in the same direction. They wouldn't destroy each other. He wasn't that naive. But they would tie each other up. They would cost each other more than either had anticipated. And every year they spent in that mutual consumption was a year the Imperium had to prepare. The plan came together in his mind with the quiet certainty of mathematics confirming itself. He would need genestealers. He would need a space Hulk.
Alright, before we go further, I just want to step out the lore for just a second and share something personal with you. Because the Octarius War is one of those stories in this setting that genuinely unsettles me every time I sit with it. And not for the obvious reasons, not because of the scale of the violence, and not because of the alien horror of the Tyranids, or the chaotic ferocity of the Orks. What unsettles me is Cryptman. Because Cryptman is not a villain, he's genuinely, sincerely trying to save humanity. He's one of the most knowledgeable people in the Imperium about the single greatest threat his civilization has ever faced. And he's watching that threat advance toward everything he has spent his life protecting. And he makes a choice that is, by any decent moral standard, monstrous. He burns worlds. He engineers a war that will consume billions of lives that had nothing to do with the decision he made. And the reason it unsettles me is that I'm not entirely sure he was wrong. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is, by design, a place where there are no good options, only less bad ones, and the Octarius War, to me, is the purest expression of that idea. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
He would need Deathwatch allies willing to follow a condemned Inquisitor on a mission that their superiors would not sanction, and he would need to be willing to live with the consequences, which he already knew were going to be severe. He had lived with severe consequences before. That was, by this point, something close to his defining characteristic. Part 4. Perdition's Flame. The match that lit the fire. Here is what Cryptman did, and it is worth going through slowly because the details matter and the audacity of it is genuinely staggering. He led a team of Deathwatch kill teams, the elite, multi-chapter alien hunting specialists of the Inquisition, into the caverns of a world called Carpathia. Their mission was to capture, alive and intact, a brood of genestealers. The genestealers are among the most dangerous individual organisms the hive mind produces. They are fast, they are strong, they hit like a freight vehicle, and they have the unique and deeply unpleasant property of being able to infect a host through a bite, implanting a genetic package that over generations produces hybrid offspring who feel an overwhelming psychic pull toward the nearest hive fleet. This is how the Tyranids seed worlds they haven't visited yet. The genestealer cult infiltrates a community, breeds with the locals, and when the fleet is close enough, the cult rises up to destabilize from within, just as the fleet arrives from above. Capturing a live genestealer, let alone a brood of them, is not a thing that gets done without casualties. Cryptman's force suffered heavy losses in the caverns of Carpathia, but they succeeded. Or they brought out a brood of genestealers secured in stasis fields, alive, imprisoned, and carrying within their biology the genetic beacon that called to the hive mind like a lighthouse calls to ships at sea. Then Cryptman and his Deathwatch allies found a space hulk. A space hulk, for those unfamiliar, is one of the grimmer features of warp travel in the 41st millennium. Over the long centuries, ships have been lost in the warp. Entire fleets, sometimes, swallowed by storms and eddies in that terrible dimension beyond normal space. These ships sometimes emerge again, fused together by warp energies into vast, tumbling conglomerations of metal and void. Space hulks, haunted by whatever survived the passage and often carrying horrors too numerous to catalogue. They drift through the void, barely navigable, as strange and dangerous and occasionally useful. This particular space hulk was called Perdition's Flame. Cryptman had the genestealers loaded aboard Perdition's Flame. The stasis fields were released. The creatures, freed from their containment, immediately began doing what genestealers do, spreading, hiding in the deep places of the hulk, breeding where they could, establishing themselves in the dark corridors and cargo bays of that ancient, drifting wreck. Their psychic signature, broadcast by their genetics, began to pulse out into the warp like a homing beacon. Then, Cryptman's Deathwatch allies detonated a nearby moon. The resulting debris and gravitational disruption sent Perdition's flame tumbling off into space on a carefully calculated trajectory, directly toward the Orc Empire of Octarius. The Hulk drifted. Orcs, being orcs, first detected this large and interesting object approaching their space and did exactly what orcs always do when confronted with a large and interesting object. They went to investigate it, and several went aboard to see if there was anything worth stealing. The Genestealers were waiting for them. The infection spread. Genestealer cults began to form in the population centers of Octarius space, growing slowly, keeping their heads down, spreading their genetic legacy through generations of hybrid offspring who felt the pull of something vast and cold and hungry approaching from the void. The psychic beacon they collectively broadcast grew stronger with every new member of the cult, every new infection, every new generation of increasingly alien hybrids. And out in the deep dark, moving on its vast, unhurried course through the galaxy, Hive fleet, Leviathan heard it. A tendril of the fleet, one of the many that had been diverted by the cordon of destroyed worlds, shifted its course. The change was subtle at first, just a degree or two of deviation from the original vector, the kind of thing that only becomes significant over the vast distances of interstellar travel. But the deviation grew more pronounced. The tendril was following the beacon. It was moving toward the Octarius sector. Cryptman's plan was working. The Inquisitor, declared outlaw by his own organization, watched with something that might have been satisfaction as the most powerful force for destruction in the known galaxy, was redirected away from the Imperium and toward the greatest green empire in the galaxy. He watched the two most prolific killing machines in existence draw together, and their trajectories converging on a cluster of star systems that was about to become the most violent place in the galaxy. He may, in those moments, have allowed himself to feel something like hope. But as observers in the Imperium would soon begin to note with increasing alarm, Cryptman had perhaps not thought through certain implications of what he had done. He had thought about what would happen when two terrible forces collided. He had thought carefully about the damage they would do to each other. What he had perhaps not adequately considered was what would happen if neither side was destroyed. What would happen if, instead of grinding each other to nothing, they simply became better at fighting each other? What would happen if the battlefield he had created was not a death trap for both sides, but a crucible that forged them both into something worse? What would happen, in other words, if Cryptman had not solved the problem of Hive Fleet Leviathan, but simply created a new and more terrible one with a delay fuse? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, the war had to begin. Part 5. The First Taste of Blood. Orok and the Fall of Gorala. The first real taste of what was coming arrived on the Orc world of Orok. The world itself was not particularly impressive by Orc standards. A rough, hostile place with the particular kind of scenic brutality that greenskins seem to find comfortable. Fortifications of scrap metal and poured rockcrete. Weapons dumps of barely controlled ammunition. The constant noise of Orc civilization, which involves a great deal of hammering, shouting, and the occasional explosive. When the first Tyranid vanguard organisms arrived, the lictors that slip ahead of the fleet in the deepest shadow, the rippers that burrow through soil and consume everything organic, the Orks of Orok had perhaps the most orcish response imaginable to discovering alien killing machines lurking in their midst. They thought it was brilliant. Here was a new thing to fight. Here was something that could actually threaten them, something that bit back, something that made the fighting interesting. The psychic warmth of pure greenskin enthusiasm radiated from Orok, and was picked up by every Orc within light years of the system. Word spread, and the way word always spreads in Orc culture, not through any formal communication, but through the collective psychic field that all Orcs participate in, a kind of species-wide emotional weather report. Something good was happening on Orok. Something was happening that made you want to be there. But Orok was not prepared for what came next. The vanguard organisms were not the attack. They were the scouting party. They were the hive mind tasting the world, learning the layout, identifying the defenses, cataloguing the population. When the bioships arrived in orbit and began launching their mycetic spores, vast biological drop pods the size of buildings, carrying thousands of bioforms packed together in dormant states, the scale of what was descending became clear even to the most optimistic Ork. The Orks of Orok were numerous. First, they were fierce. They were well armed in the particular way that Orks are well armed, which is to say chaotically but effectively, with weapons that have no right to work as well as they do. They threw themselves at the Tyranid landing zones with absolute commitment. They lost. Not immediately, not without enormous cost to the Tyranids. Ork worlds don't fall quickly, and Orok was no exception. The battle lasted long enough that the surrounding Ork systems heard what was happening and sent reinforcements. Long enough that Tyranid casualties piled up to numbers that would have represented catastrophic losses for any other species. But the hive mind had learned something crucial from the battle for Orok. Orks were worth more dead than alive. From the perspective of the fleet, their bodies, stripped down to biological components, are yielded dense, rich biomass. Their genetic material was interesting. Their sheer mass of muscle and bone and hardened flesh gave the hive mind enormous material to work with in building its next generation of bioforms. Orok was consumed. Every Ork on its surface died, and the biological machinery of the Tyranids went to work. What had been Orok's biomass became new Tyranid organisms, new bioships, new material for the hive mind's eternal project of self-improvement. And from those resources, the fleet moved to Gorala. Gorala was larger, more populated. The Orks there knew what was coming. Word had reached them, and the overfiend of Octarius himself was beginning to marshal the wider empire for what was obviously going to be a significant engagement. But the Tyranids who came to Gorala were not the same organisms that had consumed Orok. They were faster. They had adapted. The hive mind had taken what it learned from the Orks of Orok, their strengths, their weapons, their particular style of combat, and had begun producing bioforms specifically calibrated to overcome those strengths. Here is where the genius and the horror of the Tyranids becomes most visible. They do not win through superior numbers alone, though they have those in abundance. They win through escalating adaptation. Every world they consume teaches them something, and every lesson is immediately incorporated into the next generation of bioforms. Fighting Tyranids is like fighting an enemy that gets stronger, specifically in response to how you fight it, that notes every weakness you exploit and closes it. That takes your best tactic and produces a counter for it within weeks. On Gorala, the fighting was brutal beyond any adequate description. The Tyranids were initially outnumbered. The Orks of Gorala were numerous, and they had the advantage of a home terrain they knew intimately, with fortifications built by generations of paranoid greenskins who had never found a place too strong to make stronger. The initial Tyranid swarms hit walls of Ork firepower and suffered for it, but the hive mind adapted. The Tyranid forces on Gorala began to change their tactics in ways that were deeply unsettling to any Imperial observer watching the conflict. When overwhelmed, the swarm didn't fight to the death. It retreated. Not in panic, not in disorder, but in a coordinated withdrawal that preserved the greatest number of organisms possible. The retreating Tyranids sheltered in caves and underground passages until nightfall, when the synapse creatures reorganized them and the swarm emerged again to feed on the corpses, Ork and Tyranid alike, left from the day's fighting. Those corpses were not wasted. Digestion pools, concealed in the rocky terrain, rendered the fallen into biomass. The swarm grew, absorbed its own dead and its enemies' dead equally, and came back a little stronger each time. The Orks on Gorala found this bewildering and faintly irritating. They had won the fight, or thought they had, only to find that the enemy they'd killed had somehow gotten back up in a different form and come at them again. The Tyranids were simultaneously attacking, retreating, and consuming, all in a continuous cycle that the straightforward Ork tactical mind found deeply unreasonable. The breakthrough came when the Tyranids identified Gorala's central command structure, the largest and most powerful Orc war boss, coordinating the defense. The hive mind sent its dedicated assassins, the lictors, into the fortified center of the Orc position. The lictors moved through the deep places, silent and patient, stalking their target with the kind of unhurried focus that only a creature with no sense of time or self-preservation can manage. They found the war boss. He died, and with their leader gone, the Orcs of Gorala did what Orcs always do when their leader dies. They began fighting each other for the right to take his place. In the time it took for the new hierarchy to assert itself, the Tyranids were through the defensive lines. Each individual tribe was identified, isolated, and eliminated in sequence. Within weeks of the war boss's death, Gorala was silent. From the biomass of Gorala, the fleet grew. From Gorala, it spread to the nearby worlds of Deragon and Keltor, consuming both in rapid succession. Each world yielded more material. Each battle yielded more information. The bioforms the Tyranids produced with each new generation were marginally but measurably better suited to fighting Orcs specifically. And somewhere in the Octarian Empire, the overfiend of Octarius was beginning to understand the scale of what was coming for his people. He began to prepare. At Part 6, the walls of Octarius, the heart of the Empire. Fights. When the overfiend of Octarius heard what had happened to the outer worlds of his empire, he understood a few things with clarity. He understood that whatever was coming was unlike anything the Empire had faced before. Not because it was stronger, necessarily. In Orc philosophy, things that are stronger than you are simply things that haven't been hit hard enough yet. But because it was different. It didn't want glory. It didn't want to fight for the pleasure of fighting. It was simply consuming, efficiently, systematically, without rage or joy, or any of the emotions that made fighting meaningful to a greenskin. He also understood, in the way that Orc war bosses understand anything important, that this was the greatest fight that had ever been offered to him, and he was not going to miss it. The overfiend mobilized. Orcs from across the Empire gathered. The planet Octaria itself became a fortress, or rather, it became more of a fortress than it already was. Its natural mountain terrain supplemented by the frenzied construction of mechs, who suddenly had the most urgent and most interesting project of their careers. Mega weapons were built. Fortifications were extended and reinforced. The best Orc engineering talent the sector could produce was pressed into service, making the capital world as difficult to crack as it was possible to make an Orc world. When the first wave of mycetic spores fell on Octaria, the response was extraordinary. The sky over Octaria was so thick with Orc anti-aircraft fire that the rain, for a time, was genuinely diluted with falling chunks of Tyranid flesh. Quad guns. Flakadaka guns. Every emplacement the mechs had thrown together pointed upward and began making a profound statement about the Orcish position on unannounced visitors. The spores that got through, and many did get through because there were so many of them, landed in a storm of gunfire from the Orc forces on the ground below. What happened next on the slopes and plains around the Octarian capital has been described in the fragments of Imperial intelligence reports that survived the conflict as the single greatest display of mass violence the sector had ever seen. And this is a sector populated by Orcs, which is saying a great deal. The Genestealers that burst from tunnels beneath the Orc defensive lines were met by walls of Orc bodies throwing themselves into the fight with absolute commitment. Every Orc who had gathered to defend Octaria was exactly where they wanted to be, doing exactly what they had always wanted to do, fighting the most dangerous thing they had ever seen. The psychic resonance of millions of Orcs in the grip of genuine, consuming battle enthusiasm radiated out into space so powerfully that it was detectable by Imperial monitoring stations light years away. At the same time, Tyranid lictors were scaling the mountainsides that anchored the Orc defensive lines. Silent, patient, invisible against the rocky terrain, they moved from gun emplacement to gun emplacement, shutting them down one by one. When the heavy anti-air guns fell silent, the rain of mycetic spores doubled in intensity. More and more Tyranids made it to the surface. More and more Orks poured in to meet them. As the battle lines dissolved into something that barely deserves the word battle, it was more like two geological forces meeting and grinding against each other, producing heat and pressure and destruction, not through any particular strategy, but through the simple, inexorable physics of enormous masses in violent contact. Neither side could overrun the other. The Tyranids couldn't sweep through the Ork lines because there were simply too many Orks, and every one of them was fighting at peak intensity. The Orks couldn't push the Tyranids back because every Tyranid that died was being replaced and enhanced by the consumption of the Ork dead nearby. The battle achieved a kind of terrible equilibrium. Bodies piling up faster than either side could clear them, the ground itself becoming impassable with the fallen. The whole ghastly spectacle expanding outward from Octaria across the whole of the Octarius sector. And from this equilibrium, this grinding, escalating stalemate, something unprecedented began to happen. Both sides got better. Part 7. The Crucible. When war becomes evolution. Here is the aspect of the Octarius War that should genuinely disturb you, that kept inquisitorial observers awake through long nights as they filed their reports and tried to find the words for what they were seeing. The war was making both sides stronger. This had been Kryptman's worry, expressed in the coldest possible terms in his private communications, that both species, the Orks and the Tyranids, had biology that rewarded conflict, that putting them in the same place and letting them fight might not weaken both sides, but would instead create a sustained pressure that forced both into accelerated development. He had hoped for mutual consumption. He was getting mutual evolution. And that is exactly what happened. Let's talk about the Orks first, because their development was the more visible and more immediately alarming of the two. Orks grow through combat. This is a biological fact, built into them at the genetic level by the old ones who designed them as perfect weapons. The more intense the fighting, the more adrenaline analogues flood an Ork system, the more their growth hormones activate, the more their already formidable physique expands. This process is not gradual in the way human muscle growth is gradual. In an Ork experiencing sustained high-intensity combat, the growth can be visible over weeks. Their skin thickens, their bone density increases. The natural armor plating that forms in an Ork's hide becomes tougher and more extensive. Their neural pathways, already optimized for combat response, develop faster reflexes and better tactical pattern recognition through the simple iterative process of surviving things that most of their less fortunate fellows did not. A young Ork fresh from his first few fights is already a dangerous and aggressive creature, but an Ork who has spent years fighting at the level of intensity the Octarius War provided is something else entirely. Our witnesses to Octarian Orks who escaped the system before the conflict fully enclosed itself described encountering greenskins that stood head and shoulders above any Orks they had previously seen. Creatures with skulls the size of boulder slabs, with muscles that strained the armor plating grown into their hides, with a ferocity and a cunning born of years of surviving the most lethal opponent their species had ever faced. The records note that the Ork forces encountered in and around the Octarius sector in the later stages of the war were among the largest individual specimens ever documented. One inquisitorial report from the war zone Octarius campaign notes that certain Ork units were almost comparable to the greenskins described in the Apocrypha of the War of the Beast, a reference to the most catastrophic Ork invasion in the history of the Imperium, the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, when an Ork leader of near-divine power nearly destroyed the human species entirely, fielding greenskins so large that only the Emperor's own Primarchs could fight them on even terms. The Octarius Orks had not reached quite that scale, but the direction of travel was unmistakable. Beyond pure physical size, the Orks were developing in ways that had no precedent in the records of encounters with greenskins. And their mechs were producing technology of unusual sophistication. Weapons designed specifically to counter Tyranid bioform types. Vehicles built to survive the particular ways that Tyranids attack vehicles. Fortifications engineered to deal with burrowing organisms, and things that come from above, rather than across flat terrain. The creativity that Orks are capable of when sufficiently motivated was being channeled by the specific and relentless pressure of fighting an enemy that adapted to everything. Imperial intelligence analysts watching this from the fringes of the conflict noted with alarm that the Ork technological innovations emerging from the Octarius theatre were not staying in the Octarius theatre. Every Ork who left the system, running messages, delivering supplies, carrying word of the fighting to attract more participants, carried with them knowledge of new weapons, new tactics, new engineering solutions that had been developed in the crucible of Tyranid fighting. These ideas spread through the Ork psychic field in the same way that all Ork cultural innovations spread, not through deliberate communication, but through the shared resonance of a species that instinctively broadcasts what it finds impressive. Orks across the galaxy, who had never been within 1,000 light-years of Octarius, were, over time, building better anti-air defenses than they had before, because the Orks of Octarius had discovered that the Tyranids came from the sky. They were developing better strategies for dealing with tunneling enemies, better countermeasures against psychic assault, and better ways of dealing with opponents who could absorb enormous casualties without retreating. All of this was happening below the level of conscious cultural transmission, driven by the biological mechanism that had always made Orks more dangerous than they looked on paper. Meanwhile, the Tyranids were doing what the Tyranids always do, only faster. The hive mind, fed by the continuous stream of biomass from consumed Orks and the lessons extracted from billions of hours of combat data against Ork opponents, was producing new bioforms at a pace that alarmed Imperial xenobiologists. Not just variations on existing forms, genuinely new organisms, purpose-built to counter specific Ork capabilities and tactics. The records of the Octarius campaign describe creatures that fell outside the standard classification systems, organisms that the Ordo Xenos' taxonomists couldn't fit into existing categories because they represented genuinely novel evolutionary directions. There were bioforms with armored carapaces precisely calibrated against the penetration characteristics of Ork ballistic weapons. Creatures with sensory systems tuned to detect the distinctive chemical signatures that Ork commanders produced when agitated, allowing the hive mind to prioritize leadership targets. Organisms built for mobility in the specific rock and ice terrain of the Octarian mountain worlds, with limb configurations that made them uniquely effective at the kind of three-dimensional combat that mountainous terrain required. Burrowers that had specifically adapted to counter the Ork practice of cave-ins as a defensive tactic, as developing hardened shells that could survive collapsing tunnels and continue fighting. And the hive mind was not just adapting biologically, it was adapting strategically. Years of fighting Orks had forced the Tyranid intelligence into territory it had never previously needed to explore. Genuine tactical flexibility. The Orks were unpredictable in ways that most species weren't. Their enthusiasm for combat meant that they occasionally did things no rational analysis would predict, simply because the irrational option was more appealing. Fighting an opponent like that required developing responses that didn't rely on predictive modeling, that could adapt in real time to the unexpected. The Swarm Lord, which had been deployed to the Octarius theatre specifically because the hive mind's normal tactical approaches were proving insufficient, might developed through the Octarian campaign into something considerably more sophisticated than it had been at the beginning of the war. Not because the Swarm Lord grew as an individual the way an Ork war boss does. Tyranids don't work that way. But because the specific challenges of the Octarian campaign were teaching the hive mind lessons that would be encoded into every future Swarm Lord incarnation, every hive tyrant spawned for complex tactical environments, every organism the fleet produced that needed to be able to think rather than just act. Here is the really unsettling part. The Orks were adapting to Tyranid tactics, which forced the Tyranids to adapt to Ork counter-tactics, which forced the Orks to adapt to the new Tyranid bioforms, which forced the Tyranids to produce yet more novel organisms to overcome the new Ork counter-strategies. An arms race. Not a metaphorical arms race. A literal, biological, evolutionary arms race occurring at a compressed timescale, driven by the most intense sustained combat in the galaxy. And both sides were winning it, in the sense that both sides were producing better and more dangerous versions of themselves at a speed that had no precedent in the records of either species' history. One of the most disturbing observations from the Octarius theatre, noted in Imperial intelligence reports from the mid-period of the conflict, was that the war was not just happening at the macro scale of fleet battles and planetary sieges. It was happening at the microscopic scale too. Our Tyranid phage cells, the biological mechanism the fleet used to break down consumed organic matter, were encountering Ork fungal spores in the soil of contested worlds. And those spores were adapting. Mutations were appearing in the fungal populations of Octarian worlds that made the spores more resistant to Tyranid consumption, more biologically hardy, more able to survive the presence of Tyranid organisms, producing Ork populations faster in response to pressure from Tyranid ground forces. The war between Ork and Tyranid was happening below the level of individual organisms, in the chemical and biological substrate of the worlds themselves. The war spread. From the central worlds of the Octarian Empire outward, the fighting consumed system after system. Imperial worlds on the fringes of the conflict found themselves drawn in, some attacked by Tyranid tendrils probing for biomass, some raided by Ork forces whose relationship with the concept of territory had never been very strict to begin with. The conflict stopped being something happening to someone else and became a regional catastrophe that demanded a response from a galaxy that was already out of reserves. The Imperium watched. It calculated. It began to formulate what would become the cordon impenetra. And in the Octarius sector itself, the war continued to burn, hotter and stranger and more dangerous with every passing month. Part 8. The Green Prophet arrives. Gazkul Thraka at Octarius. The name Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka translates, roughly, from the Low Gothic bastardization of Orcish, as Metal Skull Big Great Orc Leader. He is known to the Imperium as the Beast of Armageddon, the self-proclaimed prophet of Gork and Mork, the most famous and most feared Orc warlord of the 41st Millennium. He once fought 2 full-scale wars for Armageddon, each more devastating than the last, and in his second invasion came close enough to conquering the planet that the outcome was genuinely uncertain for a significant stretch of time. He is enormous. He is cunning, by Orc standards, in a way that makes him genuinely dangerous rather than merely powerful. He is blessed, or claims to be blessed, by the Orc gods Gork and Mork, and has survived enough situations that should by any reasonable calculation have killed him, that the claim is difficult to entirely dismiss. By the time Gazkul arrived at Octarius, he had grown bored of the Third War for Armageddon. This is the thing about Gazkul that makes him both incredible and terrible from an imperial perspective. He doesn't stay. He wages war with the full ferocity of his considerable personality, and then, when the war stops being interesting enough, he simply leaves, looking for the next fight, the next worthy opponent, the next moment of genuine, all-consuming violence. The Orks of Octarius, locked in the most intense, sustained conflict in the known galaxy, represented the most interesting party that was currently happening anywhere. The psychic resonance of millions of Orks fighting at peak intensity was detectable across light years, and to an Ork of Gazkul's sensitivity, and whatever else he was genuinely attuned to the collective psychic wavelength of his species. It was like a beacon, a calling. He came. He announced himself in the way that Ork warbosses announce themselves, through the complete pulverization of anyone who suggested he wasn't welcome. And then he took a look at the situation. What followed is one of the more memorable entries in the records of the Octarius War, not for its strategic significance, but for its sheer character. Gazkul was surveying the battlefield, as Ork warlords do, when he was attacked by a Morlock. A Morlock is a large Tyranid bioform, a subterranean predator, worm-like and massive, that bursts from underground to attack with a maw of crushing bioweaponry before retreating back into the earth. Even against space marines, a Morlock is a significant threat. Against an unescorted warlord caught in the open, it should have been fatal. The Morlock swallowed Ghazghkull whole. This is, objectively, a bad situation. It is the kind of situation that ends most stories. A Morlock's digestive system is something you don't want to be inside, and it operates quickly. Ghazghkull tore his way out from the inside. The accounts of what followed, filtered through Imperial intelligence reports and the testimony of Ork survivors, are somewhat inconsistent on the details, but agree on the broad strokes. Ghazghkull emerged from the Morlock's ruins, covered in biological matter that was emphatically not his own, and delivered what one report delicately describes as a rallying cry to the greenskins in the vicinity. Every Ork within earshot or psychic range immediately understood that something magnificent had just happened. Ghazghkull had been eaten by one of the Tyranids' most formidable creatures and had eaten it back. The implications were immediately clear to the Ork collective consciousness. Their warlord was better than the best the enemy could throw at him. The war was going to go fine. They had their champion. Ghazghkull reorganized the Octarian Ork forces with the particular talent he had always shown for taking a chaotic mass of enthusiastic violence and pointing it in a useful direction. He worked alongside the Overfiend's commanders. There were tensions, as there always are when two enormous egos occupy the same strategy meeting. But Ghazghkull had the wisdom to understand that this was not his empire and not his war, that he was here to help and then to leave. He brought to the Octarian conflict his centuries of experience fighting the Imperium's finest warriors, and he applied them with impressive effect against an opponent he had never encountered before. The hive mind took note of Ghazghkull, a creature like him, this individual who was becoming the psychic gravitational center of the entire Ork war effort, who was drawing the fighting force of the planet together by sheer force of personality, represented a problem of a very specific kind. Not a military problem, a structural problem. Kill him and the Orks would fragment. Keep him alive and the Orks would cohere. The hive mind began formulating a response to Ghazghkull specifically. Having learned from the Morlock incident that straightforward predation was not going to work, it began considering more surgical options. But Ghazghkull, after inspiring the defense of Octarius and reorganizing the Ork war machine for a sustained campaign, did what Ghazghkull always does. He left. He declared, in the way that Ork prophets declare things, that he had a bigger destiny than this war, that Gork and Mork had more for him to do, that the greatest gathering of Orks the galaxy had ever seen was waiting for him somewhere out beyond the stars, and he was going to go find it. He departed Octarius at the head of an armada that, by Imperial estimates, numbered in the millions of ships. Behind him, the war continued. The Overfiend remained. The Orks of Octarius, inspired and reorganized, and fighting with something that had been lacking before Ghazghkull's arrival, genuine confidence, held their ground. And the hive mind, patient and ancient and utterly without anything resembling frustration, adapted. Part 9. The galaxy tears open. Chaos enters the equation. In 999 of the 41st millennium, the galaxy experienced a change so fundamental, so seismic, so absolute, that everything that came before it has to be understood as a different era from everything that came after. The Great Rift opened. While in the battles surrounding the fall of Cardia, that fortress world that had guarded the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, Abaddon the Despoiler completed his 13th Black Crusade and plunged his blade into the heart of the network of ancient devices that had kept the warp stable in that region of space. What followed was the birth of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, a vast tear in the fabric of reality that split the galaxy roughly in two, separating the Imperium Nihilus in the north from the Imperium Sanctus in the south. Warp travel and astropathic communication became enormously more difficult. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided Imperial navigators, was no longer visible from large swaths of the galaxy. The consequences for the Octarius War were immediate and significant, and they came from a direction nobody had anticipated. When the Great Rift tore open, the barrier between the warp and the material universe became temporarily and catastrophically thin in many locations across the galaxy. Demons spilled through, warp storms erupted around previously stable systems, and the servants of the Chaos Gods, sniffing the scale of violence that had been building in the Octarius sector for years, caught a scent that called to them the way a fire calls to anything cold. The followers of Khorne, the blood god, whose entire theology is organized around the principle that war and killing are sacred and that the more of it there is, the better, heard about the Octarius War and experienced something very close to religious ecstasy. Here was a war that had been running for years. Here was sustained, a massive-scale killing on a scale that the 41st Millennium, not exactly short on options, had rarely seen. Here were two species ripping each other apart with absolute commitment, generating a tide of blood and skulls that, from a ornate theological perspective, was genuinely holy. And with the Great Rift providing convenient access, the servants of Khorne began to arrive. The blood crusades that descended on the Octarius sector were led by Chaos Space Marines and demonic entities of terrifying power. Among them was the warband known as the Skull Hunt of Voda Bloodprice, World Eater's devotees, who arrived in the Octarius system specifically because they had heard about the fighting and wanted some of it for themselves. In the single year of their presence in the system, our Imperial intelligence estimated they offered over 8,000 skulls to the Blood God, the smallest of which, it was noted, was the size of a boulder. The Chaos incursion created something genuinely strange in the Octarius War, a three-way conflict. Now the Orks were fighting Tyranids and Khornate demons simultaneously. The Tyranids were fighting Orks and demons simultaneously, and the demons were fighting everybody, because that's what demons of Khorne do, with the particular disadvantage that they couldn't tell the difference between an Ork skull and a Tyranid skull as far as their religious obligations went, and both were equally acceptable offerings. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting from a strategic perspective. The Tyranids, for all their adaptability and their biological genius, and have a specific and unresolvable problem with chaos entities. Demons are not made of biomass. They are manifestations of warp energy given temporary form in the material universe, and when they are destroyed, that form dissolves back into the immaterium. You cannot eat a demon. You cannot incorporate its genetic material into your next generation of bioforms. Killing demons costs the Tyranids resources, organisms destroyed, bioforms consumed in the fighting, and yields nothing in return. Fighting demons is, from the Tyranid perspective, pure loss. The Orks, by contrast, didn't particularly care. Demons were something to fight, and Orks fight everything. The distinction between things you can eat afterward and things that vanish when killed was philosophically interesting perhaps, but not terribly relevant in the heat of combat. And Orks were growing and reproducing regardless, because that's what Orks do in the presence of conflict. So the arrival of the Chaos forces temporarily shifted the balance of the Octarius War in favor of the Orks. The Tyranids were spending resources fighting something that didn't replenish them. The Orks were fighting everybody with equal enthusiasm and growing stronger from all of it. The Overfiend, who had been on the defensive, noticed the shift and pressed his advantage. For a period of time, weeks, possibly months, the Orks were winning the Octarius War. The Swarmlord, observing this from the cold intelligence of the hive mind, recognized a structural problem. The Orks were gaining ground. The biomass equation was shifting in the wrong direction. The hive mind had invested enormous resources in the Octarian campaign and had grown its forces on the rich material of Ork worlds, had built something in this sector that it fully intended to harvest. And now, because of the intrusion of these infuriating warp-born creatures who refused to die properly, the entire investment was at risk. The hive mind made a decision. The Swarmlord, was going to Octarius. Not to command the swarm in general. The hive mind had been doing that, with greater or lesser success, through normal synapse channels. The Swarm Lord was going to hunt the Overfiend personally. The war, the hive mind had determined, would be resolved by removing its central organizing intelligence. Part 10. The Cordon Impenetra, the Imperium's desperate gamble. It would be easy, in the vast sweep of this conflict, to forget that the Imperium of man existed in the same galaxy where all of this was happening. They were, after all, the reason the whole thing started. It was an Inquisitor's plan, executed through Deathwatch soldiers, that had lit the match. And they were most immediately affected by the consequences, since the Octarius sector sat in the Ultima Segmentum, surrounded by Imperial territory that was now facing pressure from both Orks and Tyranids, spilling outward from the main conflict. The Imperium's response to the Octarius War was managed through the Inquisition and through whatever military assets could be spared from the 1,000 other emergencies of the late 41st millennium. The strategy that emerged, developed by Inquisitor Athocles van Roth and others who had inherited the problem from Cryptman, was called the Cordon Impenetra. The idea was deceptively simple. The Octarius War was, in a strange and horrible way, useful to the Imperium, because it kept both the Orks and the Tyranids occupied with each other rather than with Imperial worlds. The last thing the Imperium wanted was for either side to achieve a decisive victory and turn its full attention outward. If the Orks won, the Ork Empire would emerge from the conflict with an enormous army of battle-hardened, war-evolved greenskins and very little to fight except the Imperium. If the Tyranids won, Hive Fleet Leviathan would emerge fatter and more diverse than ever, having consumed the biomass of an entire Ork Empire, and would continue its advance toward the populated worlds of the Ultima Segmentum. So the ideal outcome, from the Imperial perspective, was for the war to never end. For both sides to remain locked in conflict indefinitely, burning through each other's resources, never quite reaching a decisive resolution. The Cordon Impenetra was designed to ensure this. A ring of worlds surrounding the Octarius sector, evacuated and fortified, creating a buffer zone that would catch anything trying to break out of the main conflict zone. Imperial forces would not intervene in the fighting itself. That was beyond their capacity and arguably counterproductive. But they would work to prevent the war from spreading further, while covertly taking steps to ensure that neither side gained enough of an advantage to end the conflict quickly. In practice, this was monumentally difficult. The Forge worlds of the Pancalis subsector found themselves at the intersection of multiple crisis fronts. Ork forces, energized by years of Tyranid fighting and looking for new challenges, began raiding Imperial systems on the fringes. Tyranid tendrils, pushed outward by the pressure of the main conflict, began probing Imperial defenses looking for biomass. The Deathwatch, the elite inquisitorial Xenos hunters, found themselves fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, not to win, but to prevent either side from gaining enough of a foothold to redirect their main effort. The fighting on the Forge world of Sigma Ulstari gives a sense of what Imperial forces were dealing with in the Octarius theatre. But the Ork warlord, World Killer, launched an attack on the Fabricator General's seat of power with Gargants, enormous walking war machines, each one a cathedral to Ork engineering excess, supplemented by hordes of boys who fought with the particular ferocity of Orks who had been fighting Tyranids for years and had grown large and mean from it. Imperial Titans, the god machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus, met them in combat. The scale of the fighting was such that entire districts of the Forge world were simply erased, replaced by ruins and craters. Meanwhile, on other worlds within the Cordon, Tyranid splinter fleets were picking at the outer defenses, consuming worlds that the Imperium couldn't spare the forces to fully protect, growing modestly on what they found and incorporating those lessons into the main swarm. And the Imperium also found itself having to deal with the complications introduced by the Chaos Incursion, specifically the aftermath of the Blood Crusades. Cornate forces that had entered the Octarius theatre and finished killing things there needed somewhere else to go, and somewhere else frequently meant imperial systems that were already dealing with enough. The Eldar, or Ealdari, also inserted themselves into the conflict during its middle period. Several Ealdari war hosts entered the war zone, fighting against Imperial and Ork forces in what appeared to be a strategy of managed disruption, ensuring that no single power base in the region grew powerful enough to threaten the balance they preferred. The Ealdari are nothing if not long-term planners, and whatever they were doing in the Octarius theatre was part of a calculation that extended well beyond the immediate conflict. Inquisitorial teams working in the sector attempted a variety of measures to prevent either side from achieving decisive advantage. At one point, an inquisitorial force working with Ealdari allies attempted to investigate Ork technological developments that were producing surprisingly sophisticated weapons, trying to determine whether some external intelligence was guiding Ork innovation, or whether the war environment had simply driven their natural genius to new heights. The investigation was cut short by a Tyranid assault that consumed the facility they were working in. Through all of this, the Imperium maintained a kind of grim, pragmatic hope. The cordon was holding more or less. The Octarius War was consuming both sides, and maybe, just maybe, it would go on long enough that the Imperium could stabilize its other fronts, reinforce its borders, and prepare for whatever emerged. But nothing stays in equilibrium forever. Least of all, a conflict as unstable as the Octarius War. Part 11. The Endgame. The Swarmlord hunts its prey. The death of the first Swarmlord at Octarius is one of the defining moments of the war's middle period. The hive mind had deployed its ultimate champion, the immortal, infinitely experienced, tactically brilliant apex bioform that serves as the hive mind's field commander when ordinary hive tyrants aren't enough. The Swarmlord had arrived at Octarius with the specific mission of breaking the Ork leadership and ending the war. The Overfiend of Octarius was not willing to cooperate with this plan. The details of the battle between these two creatures are preserved, fragmentarily, in inquisitorial records that have the quality of people trying to describe something they barely understood. The Swarmlord attacked. The Overfiend, who had spent years fighting the most dangerous organisms the hive mind could produce and had survived every encounter, met it with the full force of his considerable personal power. There are accounts of a duel of extraordinary intensity. The Overfiend's power claw against the Swarmlord's 4 Bonezords, 2 beings built by the collective genius of their respective species for exactly this kind of decisive personal combat. The Overfiend won. He crushed the Swarmlord's head in his power claw. He tore the creature in half. The body of the hive mind's greatest champion fell on the battlefield of Octaria, and for a moment, just a moment, the psychic field of the Tyranid swarm flickered as the synapse network adjusted to the absence of its most powerful node. The Orks who witnessed this responded in the way Orks respond to impossible things, with absolute uncomplicated joy. Their leader had killed the enemy's most powerful creature. The war was going to go fine. Everything was going to be wonderful. And then the hive mind spawned a new Swarmlord. This is the nightmare of fighting the Tyranid hive mind. The Swarmlord is not an individual in the way that a human commander is an individual. It carries the memories and experiences of every previous incarnation, because the hive mind stores all of that. When the Swarmlord dies, all of that accumulated knowledge is preserved. The new Swarmlord is, in every meaningful sense, the same being, except now it knows exactly how it died last time, and it knows everything the previous body learned in the moments before death about the creature that killed it. The second Swarmlord took a different approach. Not the direct assault of its predecessor. It had learned from that. Instead, it spent time. It observed the situation, considered the variables, and developed a strategy based on patience rather than force. The key insight was this: the Overfiend was powerful, But the Overfiend was not infinite. He drew his power from his organization, his lieutenants, his supply lines, his political relationships within the broader Ork hierarchy. Attack the periphery, and the center would weaken. Remove the support structure, and the central figure becomes isolated. Then act. The second Swarm Lord began a methodical campaign to isolate Octaria entirely. Thousands of bioships moved to blockade the capital world, cutting off the reinforcement ships that had been sustaining the Ork garrison. The Swarm Lord deployed vanguard organisms to strike behind the Ork lines, disrupting supply chains and communications. Meanwhile, the Tyranid forces already on Octaria received a continuous stream of fresh organisms from bioships feeding on captured territories and converting the biomass into new warriors. The Overfiend's lieutenants were identified and eliminated one by one through a combination of direct assault and surgical lictor attacks. The political structure that held the Ork Empire together began to fray as the beings responsible for maintaining it died in circumstances that were clearly anything but coincidental. On other worlds in the system, the war ground on with its usual ferocity. At Badsquig, where the Ork commander Gragnat Stompkrumper had declared the time of the big kill and deployed thousands of squigosaurs against the Tyranid lines, the hive mind deployed a bioform that the Orks had never encountered before. An enormous bio-titan that shattered the Ork assault and broke Stompkrumper's authority in his own command. The Ork warlord, undaunted, lost an arm, a leg, and an eye in an attempt to personally tame a Carnifex, which the records dryly note he merely viewed as a setback. But the momentum had shifted. And the Tyranids also made tactical adjustments in response to the beast snaggers, specialized Ork hunters who had developed effective techniques for taking down large Tyranid bioforms and riding them. The hive mind produced organisms with toxic blood, making consuming Tyranid kills dangerous for the squigosaurs and their riders. It deployed masses of smaller creatures to surround the larger ones, making it harder for the snaggers to get clean kills. The adaptation was precise, targeted, and effective. The beast snaggers found their signature tactics suddenly less reliable, and the frustration this generated. An Ork who can't get good kills is an Ork in a very bad mood, which makes Ork politics complicated, began to erode Stompkrumper's authority. On Octaria itself, the Swarm Lord waited. It watched the Overfiend's situation deteriorate. And it monitored the isolation of the capital world, the dwindling of reinforcements, the thinning of the Ork lines under sustained pressure that never quite reached the level of full engagement. The Swarm Lord was not fighting a battle. It was managing a siege, and it was managing it with more patience and more intelligence than any single Ork mind could match. The Overfiend saw what was happening. He was not stupid. No being becomes the ruler of an empire the size of Ultramar by being stupid. He understood that the enemy was maneuvering him, reducing his options, tightening a circle around him that would eventually have no exit. He fought back with everything he had, counter-attacking Tyranid positions, trying to break the blockade, attempting to maintain the communication lines to his outer systems. It wasn't enough. At the moment the Swarm Lord had been waiting for arrived when the Overfiend, engaged in one of his counterattacks against a Tyranid position, suffered a thigh wound in the death throes of a Carnifex. The wound was not immediately debilitating. Ork biology is remarkable in its resistance to injury. But it slowed him. It separated him, slightly, from the full speed of his retinue. It created an opening. The Swarm Lord summoned 2 mega swarms. The first surrounded the Overfiend's army from all sides, attacking simultaneously to prevent any directed response or organized withdrawal. The second formed a second perimeter around the first, cutting off any possibility of reinforcement or retreat. What followed was hours of fighting as brutal as anything in the Octarius War's long history. The Overfiend and his personal guard killed thousands of Tyranids. The biomass their weapons spent and their bodies lost was enormous, but the Swarm Lord had planned for this. It had sufficient reserves, sufficient incoming material, sufficient bioship support to sustain the engagement indefinitely. The Orks ran low on ammunition. Their weapons became blunted. The Overfiend's wound, never properly treated in the press of battle, worsened. His retinue dwindled. And then the Swarm Lord came in. It moved with the patience of something that had done this before. 12 times, 100 times, wearing different bodies in different bodies across different millennia. It did not rush. It did not attack with the overwhelming fury that had gotten the first Swarm Lord killed. It circled. It probed. It learned the Overfiend's fighting patterns in real time, adapting its movements to the specific quirks of this specific opponent's technique. When the Swarm Lord finally committed to its attack, it moved with a precision that spoke of intelligence rather than instinct. It parried the Overfiend's blows. It found the cable on the power claw, the hydraulic linkage that gave it its crushing force, and severed it. Without the hydraulics, the power claw became dead weight on the Overfiend's side, an anchor rather than a weapon. The Swarm Lord unleashed itself then. 2 bone swords, crackling with disruptive energy, opened the Overfiend's skull, and in a moment that felt somehow definitive, that felt like a period at the end of a very long sentence, the Swarm Lord buried its maw in the Overfiend's skull and consumed his brain. The Overfiend of Octarius was dead. For a moment, the battle that had defined the Octarius War paused. Not in the way battles pause for dramatic reasons, but in the way that happens when the thing that was organizing everyone on one side suddenly stops organizing. The Orks, who had been fighting, stopped fighting. Not out of fear, not out of despair, but out of the simple mechanical fact that the thing that had been directing their collective purpose no longer existed. In the absence of the Overfiend, no fewer than 6 Ork warlords immediately declared themselves his successor. The Empire, which had held together through years of Tyranid assault, through the sheer weight of the Overfiend's authority, began to fragment along the fault lines that had always been there beneath the surface. Different warlords pulled in different directions, of fighting each other as much as the Tyranids, falling back from positions that a unified command might have held. The Tyranids, coordinated as always by the cold intelligence of the hive mind, took advantage of every moment of greenskin indecision. Part 12. The Reckoning and its Legacy. What the Octarius War means. In the weeks following the Overfiend's death, the Ork forces in the Octarius sector did what Ork forces always do after their central authority is removed. They spread outward. They fragmented. Individual warlords and their warbands began moving away from the theater of the main conflict, some heading toward Imperial space, some toward other contested regions, some simply wandering in search of the next good fight. The Tyranids consumed Octaria, and the world that had been the heart of the greatest Ork empire in the Ultima Segmentum was stripped to bedrock, its biological richness devoured and converted into the swelling mass of Hive Fleet Leviathan. The other worlds of the empire, those not already consumed during the war's long course, were picked off in succession as the hive mind directed the momentum of its final victory toward the remaining objectives. And then Leviathan turned its attention outward. Not immediately. The consumption of the Octarian Empire took time, real time, months and years of biological processing as the fleet's digestion machinery worked through the enormous mass of material it had acquired. But when that process was complete, our Hive Fleet Leviathan was something considerably more frightening than the fleet that had entered the Octarius sector years before. It had consumed the biomass of an entire Ork empire, not just the Orks themselves, but the worlds they had inhabited, the soil they had modified with their spores, the animals they had bred, the plants and fungi that made up the ecosystem of greenskin civilization. All of that organic richness was now part of the fleet. All of those lessons, from years of combat against the most aggressive, most creative, most adaptable opponents the biological universe had to offer, were now encoded in its bioforms. The Tyranids of Hive Fleet Leviathan, after the Octarius War, were different from the Tyranids that had entered it, more diverse, more capable, adapted specifically to counter Ork tactics in ways that made them simultaneously more effective against other species who used vaguely similar strategies. There were bioforms in the post-Octarian Leviathan that Imperial xenobiologists had never categorized before. organisms that existed outside the standard designation systems, creatures that appeared to represent entirely new evolutionary directions taken during the war's long course. And the Orc survivors who scattered from Octarius, the vast majority of them, the ones who had been drawn to the greatest fight in the galaxy and had survived years of it, were equally transformed, larger than before, tougher than before, experienced in ways that ordinary Orcs simply weren't. They spread across the Ultima Segmentum, carrying with them the lessons of years of fighting the Great Devourer. And they brought with them the enhanced physical size and the battle-hardened psychology that comes from surviving things that should have killed them. This is, at its core, the awful irony of Kryptman's plan. He wanted to weaken both sides. He wanted to create a conflict that consumed both the Tyranids and the Orcs, leaving the Imperium with two diminished enemies rather than two at full strength. The calculation was not stupid. It was based on a genuine and sophisticated understanding of both species biology and their mutual capacity for violence. But he had underestimated something crucial. He had underestimated the extent to which both species were not just capable of surviving intense conflict, but were genuinely optimized for it. The Orcs and the Tyranids were not normal combatants who would be worn down by sustained fighting. And they were species whose entire biology was built around the assumption of eternal, escalating war. Putting them together didn't weaken them, it trained them. The Octarius War was, to use a metaphor that Kryptman himself would probably have found apt, not the disease he had hoped to inflict on two dangerous organisms. It was a vaccine, a challenge that both species survived, adapted to, and emerged from harder and more resistant than before. The Imperium's intelligence services, in the aftermath, produced assessments of extraordinary grimness. The Orcs, scattered from Octarius, were, in many cases, close to the scale of the greenskins documented in the ancient apocrypha of the War of the Beast, the single greatest Orc invasion in the Imperium's history, when creatures the size of Primarchs had threatened Terra itself. And that crisis had required the mobilization of the entire Imperium to address. The Octarius Orcs had not reached quite that scale. The operative word was quite. New tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan, fed and strengthened, began pushing outward from the consumed Octarian Empire into the surrounding sectors. The Tyranids had won their war, had accumulated the biomass of the largest Orc empire in the galaxy, and were now continuing their interrupted advance. The systems that the Cordon Impenetra had been protecting suddenly found themselves as the front line of a Tyranid assault that was measurably more powerful and more varied than the one they had been monitoring from a distance. The war had not solved the problem of Hive Fleet Leviathan. It had delayed it, and the price of that delay had been an Orc empire, as an unknown number of Imperial fringe worlds consumed in the fighting, and the creation of a considerably more dangerous Hive fleet than would have existed otherwise. Kryptman himself, declared outlaw by the Inquisition, had watched all of this from whatever shadowed safe house or remote vantage point his circumstances allowed. His defenders argued that without his plan, Hive Fleet Leviathan would have carved a path through the Ultima Segmentum that might have threatened Terra itself, that the delay bought by the Octarius War was an acceptable price for the survival of hundreds of worlds. His critics argued that the two emerging threats from the Octarius aftermath represented a worse long-term position than a direct engagement with Leviathan would have produced. Both arguments had merit, neither argument was comfortable. And somewhere in the mathematics of that debate, in the space between the things that were saved and the things that were created, the soul of the 41st millennium was visible in miniature. A civilization so vast and so battered and so perpetually on the edge of collapse that its best and most dedicated servants had no good options, only terrible ones. The choices Kryptman made were the choices of a man who had understood the scale of the threat clearly and had made the calculation that some lives were worth more than others, that some terrors were acceptable if they prevented worse terrors. Whether he was right is, perhaps, the wrong question. The right question might be this: in a galaxy this dark, Was there ever a good option? Or only different flavors of catastrophe? And the wisdom to choose the one that left you standing when the smoke cleared. Part 13. Echoes in the Dark. The ongoing consequences. The Octarius War did not end cleanly. Wars of this scale never do. In the immediate aftermath of the Overfiend's death, the Orc forces scattered across the Octarius sector fell into the pattern of fragmentation and infighting that always follows the removal of a central Orc authority. 6 warlords declared themselves the new Overfiend, and each of them spent as much energy fighting the others as fighting the Tyranids. In the chaos of this leadership vacuum, the Tyranids made their gains, consuming world after world, while the Orcs were too busy with internal politics to mount a coherent defense. But Orc politics, while chaotic, have a resolution mechanism built into them. Eventually, one warlord beats all the others. Eventually, a new hierarchy reasserts itself. The Orcs of the Octarius sector, broken and scattered and fighting each other, were nonetheless not destroyed. They were dispersed. And dispersed Orcs eventually reconcentrate around whatever center of gravity is strong enough to pull them together. The legacy of the Octarius War was not a dead empire. It was a shattered one, whose surviving pieces were spreading into the surrounding galaxy, each piece carrying the enhanced physical size and hard-won experience of years of Tyranid fighting. For the Imperial worlds on the fringes of the Octarian Empire's former territory, this meant that the Orc raids they had always dealt with were now being conducted by Orcs who were measurably larger, tougher, and more experienced than the ones they had dealt with before. Orcs who had spent years learning to survive what Tyranids threw at them were naturally, as a side effect, considerably better at surviving what Imperial forces threw at them. The difficulty setting of the Orc problem in the Ultima Segmentum had been raised permanently by the crucible that Cryptman had created. The Tyranid legacy was simultaneously more focused and more threatening. The post-Octarian Leviathan tendrils were probing outward with the purposeful persistence of something that knows exactly what it wants and has recently had a very good meal. The bioforms they deployed were novel in ways that unsettled xenobiologists who thought they had a comprehensive catalogue of Tyranid organism types. And the behavior of these organisms suggested tactical sophistication beyond what had been previously observed in that particular hive fleet. As if years of fighting an opponent as creative and unpredictable as the Orcs had forced the hive mind to develop genuinely flexible tactical thinking that it was now applying to different opponents. One of the most alarming assessments to emerge from inquisitorial analysis of the post-Octarian Leviathan was a suggestion that the fleet had incorporated aspects of Orc fungal biology into its own reproductive systems. The exact nature of this potential hybridization remains a matter of significant uncertainty and significant concern. But the possibility that Hive Fleet Leviathan, after years of consuming Orc biomass, can have developed biological mechanisms that increased its reproductive efficiency through something analogous to Orc spore reproduction, that the Great Devourer might have, in a sense, become partially Orc, was the kind of idea that kept the strategic collective awake at nights. The cordon impenetra, which had been designed to maintain a stalemate, found itself repurposed as a defensive barrier against the very threats it had been trying to contain. The Death Watch and Imperial forces that had been managing the edges of the conflict now found themselves in outright defensive war against Orc bands and Tyranid splinters simultaneously, fighting on 2 fronts against opponents who had both been improved by the same conflict. For the scholars of the Inquisition who would eventually try to write the history of all of this, the Octarius War presented a specific and troubling question about the nature of solutions in a universe as comprehensively hostile as the one the Imperium inhabited. Cryptman had tried to solve a problem. He had thrown an enemy at an enemy and hoped they would destroy each other. From the perspective of immediate crisis management, it worked. The Imperium bought time that it desperately needed. The Ultima Segmentum did not fall to Hive Fleet Leviathan in the closing years of the 41st millennium. But the cost, the Orc Empire of Octarius, converted into fuel for a stronger hive fleet, the surrounding systems ravaged by the overflow of a war that was supposed to be contained. Yet the strengthening of both species, through exactly the mechanism Cryptmen should have anticipated, that cost had been externalized onto the people and worlds in the war's path, and those bills would continue to come due long after Cryptman himself was gone. There is a version of the Octarius War that reads as a success story. The Imperium survived. Leviathan was delayed. The Great Rift opened and changed the nature of the crisis anyway, making comparisons between what happened and what might have happened increasingly academic. You could argue that in a galaxy with no good options, buying time is always valuable, and the Octarius War bought a great deal of time. There is another version that reads as a cautionary tale. An old man with too much knowledge and too little oversight decided that he understood the situation well enough to play God with billions of lives, and he was right that his plan would work, and wrong about what it would cost. And the difference between those two things is measured in the size of the threat that emerged from the wreckage of the conflict he engineered. Both versions are true. The galaxy of the 41st millennium doesn't let you have neat endings. It is a universe in which the best available strategy is often also a tragedy, and in which the people who understand this most clearly are the ones most likely to implement it anyway, because the alternative is something worse. And what you can say for certain is this. Somewhere in the scarred and half-consumed remnants of the Octarius sector, the war continues. The Ork warlords are still fighting each other, and the remaining Tyranid present simultaneously. Splinter fleets of Leviathan probe outward from the consumed capital world. Inquisitorial teams attempt to monitor and manage the fallout. And across the wider galaxy, the survivors of the Octarius conflict. Orks made large and mean by years of Tyranid fighting. Tyranid bioforms made strange and new by years of Ork opposition, are spreading, looking for new challenges, new biomass, new opponents to measure themselves against. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But occasionally there is a very specific kind of war, a war that doesn't just consume its participants but transforms them. Yes, that is less a conflict than a furnace, that takes in two dangerous things and outputs two more dangerous things, shaped and hardened by the heat of their collision. The Octarius War was that kind of furnace, and what came out of it is still out there in the dark, still growing, still hungry, still fighting, and somewhere in the void between stars, both species carry forward the lessons of Octarius, lessons written not in books or strategy manuals, but in the language they both speak fluently, the language of bone and chitin and blood, the language of survival pressed to its absolute limit and discovering, on the other side, something harder and stranger and more terrible than what went in. The Imperium endures, it always endures, in the particular way of things that have no better option. And in the calculus of its survival, yes, the Octarius War appears as a line item, a horror managed, a crisis deflected, a reckoning postponed, but not cancelled, never cancelled, just waiting, as things in the dark always wait, for the moment when the time is right and the opportunity presents itself and everything that was delayed comes due at once. Closing. And that is the Octarius War. Something about this story pulls at me every time I sit with it, because on the surface, it looks like a simple, what if we made these two armies fight each other scenario. But when you actually trace the threads, when you follow the logic from Cryptman's first observation of Hive Fleet Leviathan, all the way through to the death of the Overfiend, and the scattering of the Orks, and the strengthening of the fleet, you find something much richer and much darker than a simple monsters fighting monsters spectacle. You find a civilization making impossible choices at the absolute limit of its resources and trying to be wise about it, and being partly right and partly catastrophically wrong in ways that couldn't have been known in advance. You find two species whose entire existence is a rebuke to the idea that conflict weakens. Species so thoroughly adapted to violence that fighting their greatest enemy made them better at existing. and you find the recurring 40,000 theme that runs through everything in this setting. That there are no victories in the dark future, only degrees of survival, and that the price of staying alive is never, ever paid by the people who make the decision to pay it. The Octarius War is, at its heart, the story of what happens when the galaxy's greatest hunger meets the galaxy's greatest joy, and what happens when the man who arranged the meeting realizes too late that he may have been thinking about the problem wrong from the beginning. It's a story worth knowing, because both sides are still out there, and wherever they've gone, they're bringing with them everything they learned from each other in the furnace of the Octarius sector. Sleep well. If you made it to the end of this one, Mars, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for, and I am genuinely grateful you're here. Leave a comment telling me which part of the Octarius War you find most fascinating. The Ork side, the Tyranid side, Cryptman's impossible calculus, or the aftermath that's still playing out in the current lore. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to Q on 40k. We do this kind of long, quiet, deep dive into the stories that make this universe worth caring about. New episodes whenever the lore calls, which is often. Take care of yourselves. Until next time.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.